Flight 229 was almost ready for takeoff when the moment that would ignite a national conversation began quietly, almost unnoticeably in the first-class cabin. Amanda Whitmore adjusted the silk cuff of her designer blazer, her gold watch catching the morning light, as she typed a sharp response to her assistant on her phone. CEO of Whitmore Ventures. She was the kind of woman who expected perfection and usually got it. From her $9 $200 seat in 2A, she had already asked twice for her pre-flight champagne to be extra cold. Efficiency was her currency, disruption not tolerated. So when the boarding crowd began trickling into first class, Amanda barely looked up until she caught a whiff of something that didn't belong. An elderly man, slow-moving and dressed in dated khakis and a faded white shirt, approached seat 2B right next to her. His left leg dragged slightly stiff with age, and he carried a creased boarding pass with shaking hands. There was a faint scent of menthol rub and prescription ointments clinging to his clothes. His leather wallet looked like it had survived a few lifetimes. Amanda's nose wrinkled. She glanced at the man, then back at her phone, then at the flight attendant walking by. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice clipped and cool. "Are you sure he's in the right seat?" Flight attendant Rachel Kim paused, turning with polite confusion. Ma'am Amanda lowered her voice slightly, but made sure it carried just enough to be overheard by the row behind her. "Seat 2B, that's a premium seat. This gentleman seems a bit out of place." Rachel smiled professionally and looked to the man who had just sat down and placed a small photograph of a woman beside his armrest. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" He handed it to her without a word. His name, Elliot Granger. Seat 2B, first class, fully valid. "He's in the correct seat, ma'am," Rachel replied evenly. Amanda scoffed. "Right. And I suppose he paid full price." She gave a theatrical sigh. "Look, I'm preparing a board presentation, and I can't do that sitting next to someone who smells like a retirement home." Elliot's weathered face twitched slightly, but he said nothing. His eyes, tired but not defeated, remained fixed on the photograph. Amanda leaned over, speaking louder this time. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I don't care what his ticket says. First class is for professionals, not charity cases." The cabin around them hushed. Phones stopped tapping. Pages stopped turning. Rachel stood stiffly, tension tightening her jaw. But Elliot simply adjusted his seatbelt and looked forward as if he'd heard it all before and had decided long ago it wasn't worth answering. But the passengers and the country would soon realize Elliot Granger wasn't just an old man on a plane. He was a living monument to sacrifice a Medal of Honor recipient. And Amanda Whitmore had just humiliated him at 35,000 feet. Rachel Kim stood still for a heartbeat after Amanda Whitmore's latest insult echoed through the first-class cabin. Years of airline experience had trained her to defuse tense situations, but something deeper tugged at her. The elderly man sitting quietly in 2B, Elliot Granger, hadn't said a word. His posture, however, spoke volumes. There was a poise in the way he set a weight behind his silence. Rachel had seen that look before on her grandfather, a Korean war vet who never talked about the things he couldn't forget. "Logan," she murmured, catching the attention of the senior flight attendant as he passed with a tray of orange juice. Logan Ramirez had served 20 years in the Marines and carried the quiet strength of a man who'd known both chaos and calm. He had clocked Amanda's rising voice from the galley and had already begun mentally assessing the situation. Rachel nodded toward Elliot and whispered, "Something feels off. Not wrong, important. I think there's more to that man than meets the eye." Logan turned for a clearer view. Elliot sat with a worn paperback open on his lap, but his eyes weren't on the page. His fingers rested over a leather wallet that had seemed older than most passengers on the plane. It looked like it had been through a war, maybe more than one. "He didn't flinch," Rachel added, "even after being called a fraud." Logan tilted his head. "You don't sit like that unless you've stood for something." Back in the galley, Logan pulled out the crew tablet and scrolled to the passenger manifest. Row 2B, Elliot H. Granger. No military title, just a name. But instinct gnawed at him. Pulling out his personal phone, he typed Elliot Granger Army into the search bar. The top result stopped him cold. A Department of Defense archive page. Medal of Honor recipient, Colonel Elliot Granger. Vietnam, 1968. The citation describes 6 hours of holding a jungle perimeter in the Ashau Valley, buying enough time for medevacs to lift 18 wounded soldiers to safety. He had been shot twice, refused evacuation, and called artillery on his own position. Granger had served in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, decorated by 4 presidents, retired only after age 75. Logan exhaled slowly, muttering under his breath, "He's not just someone, he's the someone." Rachel leaned over his shoulder, her hand covered her mouth. "We need to tell the captain." Now, Captain Rebecca Vaughn was finalizing pre-flight checklists when Logan tapped on the cockpit door. She turned immediately, sensing urgency. "What's going on?" Logan showed her his phone. "Passenger in 2B, being humiliated by the woman in 2A. I just found out who he is." Rebecca scanned the page, her expression hardening with each word. Her own years as a Navy pilot had instilled an iron respect for anyone who earned that medal. She looked up. "Medal of Honor?" she asked. Logan nodded, confirmed. "Colonel Elliot Granger, served in 3 wars. Rebecca felt the weight of it. "Thank you, Logan. I'll handle it. We do this right." Back in the cockpit, she cross-checked Elliot's name through the Department of Defense's public veteran records. Same face, decades younger. Standing at the White House Medal of Honor around his neck. The words in the citation made her chest tighten. As they prepared for takeoff, Captain Vaughn briefed her crew through the internal channel. "We have a Medal of Honor recipient on board seat 2B. No one speaks to him with anything less than total respect. I'll make an announcement at altitude. Until then, keep everything professional. Document everything." Rachel passed by Elliot again, pausing just long enough to whisper, "Thank you for your service, sir. We'll make this right." Elliot didn't look up, but a small nod confirmed he had heard and appreciated it. Amanda, still seated in 2A, continued to complain. "This is ridiculous. I paid thousands for this seat. Now I'm stuck next to a charity case, smells like a hospital ward." Elliot remained motionless, eyes on his book, though his grip tightened on the edges. Logan moved through the cabin, discreetly informing passengers seated nearby. Word began to ripple, carried with reverence. In 3A, a businessman named Ray Masters, a retired Army Ranger, instinctively knew. When he heard Medal of Honor, he stiffened and stood. "Sir," he said quietly to Elliot, offering his hand. "It's an honor." Elliot looked up, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. He accepted the handshake. "Thank you, soldier." When the plane reached cruising altitude, Captain Vaughn activated the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone special aboard this flight." Amanda rolled her eyes. "Oh, great, another sales pitch." In seat 2B, Vaughn continued, sits Colonel Elliot Granger, United States Army, retired. Colonel Granger is a recipient of the Medal of Honor, awarded for heroism in Vietnam. He served in Korea, Iraq, and gave more than 5 decades of his life to this country. The cabin fell silent. Colonel Granger held the line so others could live. He represents the very best of what America stands for. It is our profound honor to have him aboard. The silence shattered into spontaneous applause. One by one, passengers turned toward Elliot. Some saluted, others simply nodded with tears in their eyes. Amanda shrank back into her seat, and for the first time in hours, Elliot Granger smiled. Logan Ramirez had barely stepped back into the galley when the call came through his earpiece. Captain Vaughn wanted to speak with him immediately. He walked swiftly to the cockpit, glancing briefly over his shoulder at seat 2B. Elliot Granger was sitting quietly, a humble figure in a pressed jacket, his eyes fixed on the clouds outside and as if searching for something long lost. Captain Rebecca Vaughn stood when Logan entered the cockpit. Her eyes, sharp and composed, were clouded with something deeper. Now, respect, maybe even awe. I looked up. "Colonel Granger," she said, skipping formality. "Logan, we have a Medal of Honor recipient on this plane. 18 soldiers pulled out of an ambush in '69. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Iraq. He kept serving until '77. He's a national treasure, and he's sitting back there being treated like luggage." Logan nodded grimly. "Amanda Whitmore has no idea what she's done." "Then let's make sure she does," Vaughn said, reaching for the intercom button. Back in first class, Amanda had escalated to full meltdown. "This is unacceptable," she barked to Rachel, Kim waving her phone as she recorded. "I'm being forced to sit next to a man who clearly doesn't belong here. This airline is going to regret this. I'll have legal file." The cabin lighting dimmed slightly, and then with a soft chime, Captain Vaughn's voice came through the intercom, strong and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm sorry to interrupt your flight, but something important needs to be said." Amanda paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. The quiet hum of jet engines was suddenly all that could be heard. "Today in Seat 2B, we have someone very special traveling with us. Colonel Elliot Granger, retired United States Army. Colonel Granger is a recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military award. He earned it by rescuing 18 wounded soldiers under heavy fire in the jungles of Vietnam. He continued to serve our country for nearly 5 decades across multiple wars. The silence that followed was electric. Colonel Granger Vaughn continued, her voice thickening. "Just slightly on behalf of this crew and every grateful American on board, I want to say thank you. Thank you for your service, your sacrifice, and your quiet dignity. We are honored to have you with us." Applause didn't erupt, it exploded. Passengers from first class to the back rows of economy clapped, some standing, some cheering. A teenage boy near the front put his hand to his heart. A mother with a baby began crying quietly. Even some flight attendants wiped their eyes. Elliot turned in his seat, stunned. His hands trembled as Rachel Kim leaned in and said gently, "Colonel, the captain would like to meet you in the cockpit if you're comfortable." He stood slowly, steadied by Logan, who gave him a proud Marine's nod. As he walked up the aisle, the applause followed him. Strangers reached out to shake his hand to thank him. Some just nodded, their faces filled with emotion. Amanda Whitmore. She was frozen in place, mouth open, her phone recording her own downfall. Rachel gently reached over and clicked it off. Inside the cockpit, Captain Vaughn stood and saluted. "Colonel," she said, "I flew for the Navy before I became a pilot. I've saluted a lot of heroes. But you redefined the word." Elliot tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Vaughn stepped forward and pinned a pair of honorary pilot wings to his chest. "It's not much, sir," she said. "But from one officer to another, it means the sky is yours." Tears welled in Elliot's eyes as he returned the salute. "Thank you, Captain. That means more than you know." Back in the cabin, Logan and Rachel had taken action of their own. Amanda's outburst had been documented by multiple passengers. One had already begun uploading it online. Others were organizing a thank you card, scribbling messages on napkins, boarding passes, anything they could find. When Elliot returned to his seat, the businessman in 3A stood. "Colonel Granger," he said, voice shaking, "I served in Desert Storm. If you hadn't done what you did in Vietnam, a lot of guys like me might not have made it back. Thank you." Elliot placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "We were all just doing our jobs," he said softly. "That's what service means." Amanda shrank into her seat as passengers glared her way. Not with anger, but with the cold disapproval that only truth can bring. Her power meant nothing now, not in the presence of someone who had paid with blood and bone. The rest of the flight passed in reverent quiet. Elliot sat peacefully, surrounded by dignity, no longer just a passenger but a symbol, a reminder of values too often forgotten. And somewhere high above the clouds, redemption soared, not just for Elliot Granger, but for a nation reminded of what honor truly looks like. The ripple effect of Captain Vaughn's announcement was immediate and far-reaching. Within minutes of landing, several passengers had uploaded their recordings to social media, and by the time Elliot Granger stepped off Flight 229, his name was trending on multiple platforms. Hashtags like #HonorElliot, #Medal of Honor Hero, and #Respect Our Veterans were climbing with astonishing speed. What began as a moment of cruelty had turned into a national reckoning. Amanda Whitmore, once proud of her status and control, exited the terminal under a different kind of spotlight. Her attempt to maintain composure failed beneath the sea of phones, flashing cameras and pointed whispers. Within hours, Sterling Holdings released a terse statement acknowledging her behavior and placing her on indefinite leave pending internal review. By day's end, she had been officially removed from her executive position, and her personal statement, an attempt at contrition, was met with widespread skepticism. Meanwhile, Elliot remained stunned by the outpouring of affection. Reporters camped outside the hotel where he was staying. Flowers, letters, and handshakes flooded in. Strangers thanked him in the street. The airline's CEO called him, personally issuing a public apology and announcing that Elliot would receive free lifetime travel as a token of gratitude and respect. But none of it compared to the call that came 2 days later. It was from the Department of Veterans Affairs inviting Elliot to speak at a panel on aging veterans in national memory. His initial instinct was to decline. He had spent decades avoiding the spotlight, hiding even his most decorated moments from public view. Yet something inside him had shifted. The incident aboard Flight 229, as humiliating as it had been, had forced a truth into the open. Far too many veterans were being forgotten. At the panel, Elliot took the stage in a modest brown blazer and the same Medal of Honor pin he had worn in 1968. He didn't read from a speech. He didn't need notes. He simply talked about Margaret, his late wife, and how she had kept his heart soft after war had hardened everything else. He spoke about the young men he'd led in combat, some of whom never returned. And he talked about kindness, the kind that used to bind communities and now too often had to be earned in viral videos. The footage of his remarks was viewed over 14 million times within a week. Overnight, Elliot Granger became more than a veteran. He became a voice. Invited to speak at high schools, universities, and even a televised town hall, Elliot used his newfound platform not for bitterness, but for building bridges between generations. He challenged the younger public to listen, to remember, and above all, to treat every elder not as a burden, but as a living archive. Flight crews across the country began a quiet campaign in his honor, reserving one seat per flight as a symbolic tribute to veterans. Airlines re-examined their air customer service policies, particularly in how they addressed elderly passengers and those traveling with visible disabilities. The Federal Aviation Administration even issued a directive promoting new sensitivity training initiatives, naming Elliot's story as a driving catalyst. Back in his small hometown in Ohio, Elliot's world began to change as well. His mailbox overflowed daily letters from fellow veterans, young students, and even airline employees who confessed to having cried watching his moment of redemption unfold midair. One particularly touching letter came from Logan Ramirez, the senior flight attendant and former Marine who had first noticed Elliot's demeanor on the plane. "You reminded me of who I wanted to be when I joined the Corps," Logan wrote, "and who I still hope to be." For Elliot, the fame never felt natural, but the mission did. He began working with veteran outreach programs, particularly those targeting isolation among aging servicemen. He launched a small initiative, Project Quiet Valor, to distribute video interviews of elderly veterans telling their stories. If they won't speak for themselves, he told one interviewer, we'll help them be heard. Through it all, Elliot never spoke Amanda Whitmore's name. He never expressed anger, only a profound hope that the incident had helped teach a broader lesson about decency. Amanda, for her part, remained mostly out of the public eye, though sources later confirmed she sent a private letter of apology. Elliot received it. He read it. Then quietly he forgave her. 3 months later, on what would have been Margaret's birthday, Elliot stood at her grave holding a bouquet of wildflowers and a printout of an article titled Colonel Elliot Granger Medal of Honor, Hero Now a Voice for the Voiceless. He placed it beside her headstone next to the flowers. "You were right, Maggie," he said softly. "One person really can make a difference, even if he's just an old soldier flying coach through life." Months later, Elliot Granger stood once more in Arlington National Cemetery, a gentle autumn breeze rustling through the rows of white headstones. In his hands, he carried a bundle of worn letters, some typed, many handwritten, all deeply personal. They came from teenagers, fellow veterans, mothers, pilots, teachers, people from every walk of life who had watched his story unfold and felt something awaken in them. He walked slowly to the familiar grave, Margaret's name etched into marble, her resting place shaded by a tall oak tree. He knelt, his knees stiff from age but steady with purpose, and laid the small U.S. flag from Flight 229 at the base of her stone, the very flag Captain Vaughn had handed him after the passengers gave their standing ovation. "I wish you'd seen it," Maggie Elliott whispered, his voice catching. "They remembered us. They remembered me." He unfolded a few of the letters and placed them gently beside the flag. One was from a young Navy recruit who wrote, "Because of you, I've decided to serve with my head high." Another from a widow in Kansas. "My husband died in Korea." You reminded the world why his life mattered. Elliot closed his eyes, breathing in the stillness, letting the warmth of those words fill the spaces grief had once hollowed out. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel forgotten. His story had become more than just a moment aboard a plane. It had become a call to conscience, News networks had used it to start conversations about veteran care. Schools had invited him to speak. Strangers who might once have looked away now stopped to shake his hand. But Elliot knew the real honor wasn't in the attention. It was in the quiet change how one man's dignity had reminded a nation what respect really meant. As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, he stood steadied himself with his cane and offered one last look toward Margaret's grave. "We're okay now," he said softly. "They know who we are. No one should ever have to earn basic human dignity. And yet, when one act of kindness pierces through cruelty, it can ripple across hearts, communities, even an entire nation. True honor isn't worn on the chest, it's carried in how we treat others, especially those whose service was given in silence." If Elliot Granger's story moved you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or honor a veteran in your life.